Hi, I am Sarah Skwire. I am the Director of Communications and a Senior Fellow at Liberty Fund here in Indianapolis. And today I am here with Heather King, the Chair of the English Department at the University of Redlands, and Clark Neely, Vice President for Legal Studies at the Cato Institute. And we thought we would spend a little time together today talking about this novel, The Law and the Lady by Wilkie Collins. Wilkie Collins is not as much read now as he once was. He was an enormously popular Victorian writer, best buddies with Charles Dickens, and famed for writing some of the earliest detective novels in the English language, and as well as the classic Gothic masterpiece, The Woman in White. I wanted to talk about The Law and the Lady today, because it does focus so much on legal issues that it struck me that it would be a really good opportunity to bring both a literary expert and a legal expert together and turn them onto this same text and see what happens. So the novel was written in 1875. It is the first full-length novel in English with a female detective, which makes it a bit of a historic thing. And I thought maybe we'd start today just by asking each of you to talk a little bit about what first struck you about the novel, coming at it from your perspective, either from literature or from law. I'm not sure who wants to go first, but I'll let you fight it out.
Well, law comes first in the title, so I feel as though I should cede.
Oh, Law and the Lady. So, all right.
Would it be an undue cliche to come back with ladies first?
After reading the novel, no, it sort of beats you into that, doesn't it?
I think it's more a piece of literature than it is a piece of legal fiction. So maybe, Heather, you should start.
Yeah, sure. So I am not deeply versed in Collins, so this was a really fun read. Some of the initial literary things that stood out to me, construction of gender is fascinating, and I think it does actually connect to some of the legal questions because there's so much work throughout the novel in trying to define terms and figure out, is something this or is it that? And so to have all of these chaotic gender constructions working against this effort to codify things was really fascinating. There's a tension going on in that. The law of nature is being challenged a lot throughout the novel. I also was surprised in some ways, I guess, by ways in which I see it anticipating some of the elements of Stoker's Dracula, which comes about 20 years after this, particularly parallels between Valeria and Mina Harker in Dracula, who also undertakes things that are beyond her usual capability for the sake of her husband, much like Valeria is doing here, and who is flirting with the persona of the new woman to do so. And I think there's a through line there that I wasn't aware of before. And then, of course, looking backwards, the structure of the title that I was joking about a minute ago made me think of the way Jane Austen's novels ended up titled and the way we're forced by the title to wrestle with the relationship between those terms. So what does it mean that it's the law and the lady? Why is law first? What is the relationship that's encapsulated within that? And are they working together, or is it a confrontation between them? How does it switch between those? So those were a couple of the things. And then, of course, because it has the elements of a detective story working through this legal question, the way that the book again and again explicitly raises the question of interpretation and how many different ways you can interpret things. And because Valeria is giving us this account of the case, occasionally she synthesizes, occasionally she presents someone else's voice. So I was fascinated by who we get to hear unmediated, who is mediated, and finally, who is Valeria talking to? Because there are several times where the text addresses the reader directly, and I had no idea who we were supposed to be. Why is she writing this? How long after the events is she writing it? She's still second guessing and reinterpreting when she's writing this. She tells us she's not writing it from notes, and yet there are things that are quoted extensively. So the whole conceit of the narrative I also thought was really interesting.
Okay. Clark, maybe you want to start by stating the facts of the case for us. Because it suddenly
Actually,
occurs to me that people listening to this aren't going to know what's our turning point of our plot here.
okay, I will. I wanted to start off with some sweet 19th century mansplaining, but I will come back to that.
Excellent.
So the facts of the case are that our heroine, Valeria, starts off the novel marrying a man who we take to be older than her. He's a bit of a mystery. And after the wedding, the thing that's a bit of a mystery is that neither his mother nor any of his friends will sort of give him a character reference or approve the wedding. So there's something up. What we discover, sort of piece by piece after the wedding, is that he has this dark secret that he urges Valeria not to look into, because he says, if you find out the secret, it will destroy any future that we have together. But she does. And what we discover is that he was tried for the murder of his first wife in Scotland several years before.
Yeah, not really worth mentioning.
It could happen to anybody, And that really is the dramatic tension of the rest of the novel, is whether Valeria is going to dig deeper into the secret, spoiler alert, yes, and what she is going to learn about this trial. She was out of the country at the time, so that's the sort of the reason why she supposedly didn't know anything about it, but the trial was a national sensation, and it results in this verdict that we do not have in America, and that they apparently do still have, at least for the time being, in Scotland. And it's referred to throughout the book as the Scotch verdict, which of course gets my heart going pitter-patter because it has the word Scotch in it. But it's a verdict that we don't have in America, that is a conclusion from the jury that the charge is not proven. The defendant is not acquitted, so they don't. They're not found to be innocent, but neither are they found to be guilty. And there's a passage I think that really drives home in the book the significance of this verdict for a defendant in the 19th century. We have Valeria saying of her husband Eustace, "He knew, poor fellow, the slur that this verdict left on him," and his character Eustace feels that very much, to the point where he can't even disclose to this woman that he loves that he has been left in this state of having been found, that the charge of murdering his wife by poison was not proven, but neither was he acquitted in this proceeding.
Can I just interject to bring up the fact that the novel also says no other civilized nation has this verdict, that it's really presented as this incredibly unusual. And it also says that Valeria feels as though the jury has cut corners, basically. They couldn't rise to the challenge of interpretation, and so they threw up their hands and said, not proven.
I'm waiting for the 19th century mansplaining, Clark.
Oh, yay. All right. So during the initial meeting, or I guess it was technically I think it's the second meeting between Valeria and what turns out to be a key character, and I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly, Miseramis Dexter, who is a fascinating character, was born with a significant birth defect. He essentially is missing everything, all of his lower extremities, and has a rather manic disposition. Let's just leave it at that. But there's this beautiful scene where he decides that he will cook for her, and he's going to cook her truffles stewed in Burgundy wine. And he says that he needs to stop conversing with her while he's cooking, because cookery, and I like to cook myself, cookery requires one's full attention. And then here comes the mansplaining. He says, as a rule, women are incapable of absolutely concentrating their attention on any one occupation for any given time. And that's why he needs to focus on the cooking. And, we mentioned before that there are just unbelievable layers of sort of gender and intrigue in this. And it's fascinating because he's speaking to the one character in the book who has showed the most ability of concentrating their attention on one single occupation.
Right. I mean, Valeria would be better off if she could think about anything else,
right,
ever.
Right. But the irony is there is beautiful. And he does follow up by saying that women are infinitely superior to men in the moral qualities, which are the true adornment of humanity. So he's batting 500 in this scene, arguably, in describing women in such presumptuous terms.
Well, I'm interested because Heather brought up early on that we have this title, The Law and the Lady, that tells us what the book is going to focus on, or tells us maybe what the publisher thought the book was going to focus on, right? But we have a whole series of ladies who are involved in this case, right? We've got Valeria herself, right, who would be the obvious choice for being the lady of the title. But we have Miserrimus Dexter has a sister named Ariel, right? Cousin, sorry, who's present largely throughout the novel. And then we have, as is of course traditional in Gothic fiction, right, this mysterious figure of the first wife, right? The mysterious and threatening first wife who's only on stage in people's recollections or in people's diary entries or letters about her. We never meet her in the flesh, right? But she's never absent once we discover that she ever existed at all, right? And then, as I was reading, and I was reading all of these descriptions of Miserrimus Dexter and all of his writing, he's so feminized in his presentation, even though he does this classic mansplaining stuff, right? He's so, he's half a man, he's immoderate in his temperaments, he can't control his curiosity. There's all of these kind of classic Victorian tropes about what women are like that he absolutely fulfills.
Flamboyant dresser and user of beard perfume.
Yes.
Yes. Well, and that he says he wants to be beautiful, that he does. Yes. He thinks that it is a declension of masculinity that men have stopped dressing beautifully. So when he shows up in the pink satin jacket and the big bracelets on his wrist, he likes to be pretty, he says. Yeah. Fascinating.
Plus, spoiler alert, he goes completely nuts at the end and is locked up in a madhouse, which is another classic Victorian Gothic novel trope for what happens to women when it's all just too much, right? And so I'm fascinated by all of that stuff happening.
I thought maybe part of the message there was that, as in Ghostbusters, you have to be careful not to cross the streams of masculine and feminine, or you completely lose your mind.
I'm thinking.
Go ahead, Heather.
I was just going to say, as we're thinking of the eccentricities of Miserrimus Dexter, also his bringing out embroidery so that he can listen more attentively because his hands are occupied, and that's another time, Clark, that he says women are smarter for doing this. I'm learning from women. So that was really interesting.
Well, idle hands are the devil's workshop.
Absolutely. And it's interesting too to have him, in such contrast to Valeria, who's so active and so involved in this process of detection, of winnowing out every fact she can find about her husband's court case. What did you guys think about her, detection skills? What did you think, Clark, especially about the evidence that she gathers and the strength of that evidence? I mean, obviously at the end we do get a big reveal. We get a victim statement, if you will, at the end, right? That clears everything up for us. But what did we think about the detection process, the evidence that's gathered?
Well, I thought it was wonderful. And as a lawyer, as a career litigator, one of my favorite lines in the book is when everybody's expressing this skepticism that a mere, a lay woman could possibly unravel a case that has, defied the most learned lawyers in Scotland, as an aside, Scotland. But she says, and this rings true to me based on my experience as a litigator, I shall ask all sorts of questions which grave lawyers might think beneath their dignity to put. And that, first of all, that's really good lawyering. You have to ask those questions. They can be very uncomfortable. But that, she doesn't need to be learned in the law. She is unwavering in her commitment to getting to the bottom of this incident. She is unwavering in her faith in her husband, despite having been given, a mountain of reasons to not be confident in him. And she's unwaveringly confident in herself and her own ability to unravel the case. And she has this amazing, sort of, I would say, intuitive sense of what that will take. And she pursues it single-mindedly in a way that made me, really admire her tremendously. I think she's a wonderful character.
Heather, do you think this is a cautionary tale about irresponsible marriages? There's a lot of those, right?
Right.
They're usually subplots.
Right. And I mean, weirdly, Eustace is paying a price for having been too much of a gentleman, basically. So that part of with his first marriage, that cautionary tale sort of cuts against the grain in a way.
Yeah.
I mean, I had wanted to say something about Valeria as detective, though, because she starts this undertaking out of her love for and confidence in Eustace, and she knows he's innocent. She's going to prove to the world that he's innocent. She is constantly thwarted in her efforts by men and women who think that she is acting inappropriately. She constantly relies on her femininity as an investigative tool. She knows that people will say things to her because she's a woman that they wouldn't say to a man, which I think is fascinating. So she's not being at all manly in her investigation. She's counting on, and not feminine wiles, she's not being at all seductive about it, but that perhaps because of assumptions about women's heightened emotionality, that men will say things to her that they won't say to other men, which I thought was a really interesting way to pitch it. But most puzzling to me was that when it looks as though everything is in train and she can sort of let things go and she's being dissuaded from continued involvement, she can't give it up because it has become the purpose of her life. It's no longer for her husband. It is for her that she is trying to accomplish this thing. And I thought that was a really interesting shift towards the end. And the narrative doesn't make much of it at all. But as she's talking about it, she thinks, how can I give this up? This is I forget exactly the terminology, and I was going back and forth between listening and reading. And so some things I remember hearing and don't remember the page, but she really describes it as the end of her existence has become this case. And it's her existence, not her husband's existence anymore. So I thought that was an odd shift to include. But as a cautionary tale, I mean, I don't know, it kind of pays off for Valeria. I don't think she really, for Miserrimus Dexter, yeah, maybe. Don't, be careful about letting your brains boil too much.
Well, but I think in the same way that in Pride and Prejudice, right, when Wickham runs off with Lydia, right, his punishment is that he is married to Lydia at the end, right, which is a terrible punishment to face. In a certain way, right, Valeria's imprudent marriage, right, she does all of her investigating after the marriage. She doesn't do any real investigating beforehand to find out much about who this guy is. Even when there are, as the kids would say, red flag, red flag, red flag, red flag, right, everywhere you look, right? And then what she gets at the end, and spoiler for the end of the novel, if people want to mute me now, what she gets at the end is the great pleasure of being married to someone who was so cruel to his first wife and so neglectful of his first wife that he drove her to suicide, and who didn't respect his second wife enough to tell her. I'm not sure that's a happy ending.
Right. So
Clark has unmuted. I want to know.
Yeah, go for it.
Well, now I feel like we've turned this into a class action, and I represent my gender. No, I'm not gonna go to bat for Eustace, but I was gonna maybe comment really quickly on a couple things that struck me that were very authentic about the description of events in court.
Yeah, please.
Different countries have different procedures. Obviously, I've never been in a Scottish courtroom, never expect to be, even though I'm somewhat Scottish on my father's side. But one thing that people might not think, but it is absolutely common, is nervous laughter in the courtroom. And this happens a couple of times during the trial. And I thought I would share a really quick anecdote because it's really funny. I was clerking for a federal judge here in DC in the mid 90s when he actually presided over the first class action sexual harassment suit that was ever brought in America. And it was a bunch of women who worked as prison guards. They were guards in a prison here in DC. And the way they were treated by their male colleagues would put barnyard animals to shame. In fact, barnyard animals would protest to be compared to this. And to make a long story short, one of the women was particularly compelling in her testimony. And as you might imagine, the testimony was necessarily quite graphic. And you could tell that she was embarrassed to have to relate these kind of squalid details about, what had been proposed to her. And so at one point, she was speaking in just above a whisper, and her lawyer asked her to relate, a particularly embarrassing incident. And at the moment when she had to mention a particular part of anatomy, she leaned right into her microphone so that suddenly the volume of her voice went up really loud. She says this word, blah, and she didn't mean, she was trying to be quiet, and it was loud, and everybody just laughed. And then when he took her back through this to summarize, she did it again on the exact same word. And this time, like, everybody just lost it in the whole courtroom. Because, you needed a break from this horrible litany, of just disgusting behavior that had been visited upon these women. And I think that that happens. I've never, thank goodness, I've never been involved in a death penalty case. So I imagine those probably don't involve this kind of humor, but every other kind of case, and certainly the ones that I have been involved in, I don't think I've ever seen a case that I've been involved in where there wasn't some humor. And it's again, I think it's because there's so much at stake. Oftentimes the emotions are so strong that we need that sort of catharsis of being able to just have a moment where we can all laugh together at a thing. And so I thought that was a really remarkable snapshot of something that really does happen, in my experience, in court, and not something you would expect, or not something you would know about if you hadn't seen it or done it yourself.
Well, and Collins was a journalist as well as a novelist, right? So I would assume that he had probably sat in on a variety of legal cases over the years, and was maybe bringing some of that into the novel when he did.
I mean, I guess I would be surprised to find out that they used to laugh in 19th century Scottish courtrooms.
But hey.
Well, but as he tells us later in the book, I've got to read this quote because it's awesome. The incomprehensible submission of Scotchmen to the ecclesiastical tyranny of their established church has produced a very mistaken notion of the national character in the popular mind, because they're actually quite fun and nice. But if you only know them from their ecclesiastical activities, you would think that Scottish people are dour and no fun. And anyway, I'm sorry. I just had to read that passage. It was fantastic.
That's right. I have Adam Smith right over here on the side, so he's feeling defensive, but that's okay.
Well, that they are humorless or drunkards, because those are the two activities that are left to them on Sundays because of the extreme sound.
To exhibit oneself in church, or the liberty to seclude oneself over a bottle.
Yeah.
Heather,
I want to return to the question of Eustace, because, pardon the pun, but I think the jury is still out about what kind of husband he was. Because, I mean, Miserrimus Dexter says that Sarah McCallum was one of those people who was born to be unhappy. And
Sarah McCallum is the first wife.
Yeah. And we get the letters from the friends to Sarah McCallum that are part of the evidence of the trial. And some of them are sympathetic to her plight, but they clearly have their own. This is part of the really fascinating way interpretation and bias gets presented throughout the novel again and again. So the woman who has been cheated on by her husband immediately jumps to the sympathetic reading of "your husband is a monster." The young woman who is not yet married and doesn't have the experience of that kind of intimate relationship assumes that because he has stopped being the boyfriend and is a husband instead, he must be a monster. But the woman who is in a long-term marriage is like, you might be exaggerating a little bit. Like, let's calm down. So yes, he didn't love her, and he says things in his diary that make it clear that his emotional energies are focused in
Elsewhere.
a different direction. Yeah. But he also says that he tries really hard to be kind and to not be neglectful. And he's out running errands, buying how much arsenic for the woman, like multiple times, going out. So doing her bidding, not really knowing why. You know, a biddable husband is not a bad thing necessarily. So I listened to it and read it twice through and found myself going back and forth on what kind of a husband had Eustace been to Sarah. And I'm not sure that we're supposed to think he was a terrible husband. I'm really taken by your comparison to Pride and Prejudice and the invocation of Lydia and Wickham, because Sarah McCallum has definitely got a streak of Lydia in her, showing up at Eustace's apartment unbidden. Like, that is a huge scandal. And the fact that he does the only thing he can to cover it up and save her from destruction. Like, her life socially would have been over at that point. She was never going to get another marriage offer after behaving that way. So he really saves her, thinking that, you know, all of his other romantic aspirations are for naught at this point. So I do think it was kindly intended. He's trying to be compassionate. So maybe part of the cautionary tale is don't try to rescue other people. But I think it also is definitely that Sarah has done something really ill-advised and got really lucky that it didn't turn out worse, if you take the read that at least she has, you know, a husband to save her good name and an establishment, and, you know, it could have been a lot worse. But maybe I'm being overly generous to Eustace.
I don't know. I was thinking of the Lydia and Wickham comparison as being more about Eustace and Valeria, right? Valeria gave basically no thought to Eustace, marries him against all of the advice of friends and family, with a guy who can only get letters from his friends saying, I can neither confirm nor deny that he will make a good husband. Basically, I take the fifth. He's a gentleman, and that's all I'm going to say. And he won't speak with her further about it. And she marries him anyway, and she gets what she gets.
But I add one thing to what Heather said.
Yeah.
I agree with all of it. I think I'm as best I can tell, I'm exactly where she is. You know, this is to me one of those situations where it seems that maybe you think it would be easy in the abstract, but then if you really put yourself in the position, think about this poor man, Eustace, who, you know, essentially fell on a grenade. He married this woman he wasn't in love with to save her reputation, right? She's, as Heather points out, she's never going to get married after what she did. You know, even what to us would seem like a relatively minor transgression of, you know, showing up uninvited to a man's, you know, bedroom. Even though nothing apparently happened. So in my sense of that, Eustace feels like maybe he should get a second chance. You know, I should get a chance to be happy. And, you know, he falls in love with Valeria. And there's a wonderful, wonderful sort of psychological scene setting around page 105 in my edition, where he's trying to explain to Valeria why it is that he felt that he couldn't tell her, just come clean, which is what you would think, you know, oh, just come clean. If she loves you, she'll stay with you. And he describes the likely progression of events of what would happen as she becomes more suspicious and reads into everything, you know, that he says or does that may be, you know, sort of negative. The whole history of his first marriage will come back. And the quote that I wanted to read, which I think is so beautiful, is he says, "Do you see what materials for domestic hell are mingling for us here?" Yeah. In other words, if I had come clean with you, and now every time you look at me askance, I'm going to wonder, are you thinking I'm going to poison you? And it just could never have worked. And you know what? Maybe he's right, maybe he's wrong. But man, I would say, does Collins make a plausible case for you know what may well have happened had he come clean and been honest with her and tried to play it that way?
Yeah, and that's you know, I think one of the interesting things about The Law and the Lady and its focus on this verdict that we don't have, right? This not proven verdict, right? Is this way in which it made me think while I was reading it about the way that that legal verdict hangs over Eustace's head inevitably for the rest of his life. comparable to the way that incarceration hangs over people's heads for the rest of their lives. And you can imagine that same kind of conversation happening for somebody who had been convicted of a crime, had served their time, who had been released, and now has to sort of face going through the world and having these conversations over and over and over again. And so weirdly, this novel, which is about such a specific to one nation kind of a verdict, and so grounded in Victorian literary, it would be hard to find more of a Victorian novel really than this one, has, I think, some really pertinent things in it for thinking about contemporary legal issues and contemporary social issues as well. I mean, not even to get into what it can have us thinking about contemporary gender discussions. And I think that's fascinating.
I'll quickly say one thing. There's an interesting parallel, Sarah, to what you just said. So one of the most fraught areas of the criminal law is exoneration. In other words, when somebody has been convicted of a crime and they are later exonerated, it's later determined that, in fact, they were innocent all along. And there's a wrinkle to this that is so appalling and I think reflects some of what you just suggested about the not proven verdict. It is not unusual when the evidence begins to mount of a person's innocence after they have been convicted, that a prosecutor will make the following offer to the person. They'll go and they'll say this: look, I'm not going to move to dismiss the charges or reopen the case and dismiss so that you can be fully acquitted, but I will do this. If you will agree to do something called an Alford plea, which is essentially where you don't plead guilty, but you acknowledge that the prosecution has sufficient evidence to convict you, then I will go to the judge and say, upon basically receiving this new plea, this Alford plea, we should sentence this person to time served. So in effect, they're letting you out of prison in exchange for your willingness to stop challenging the validity of the verdict and enter this squirrely thing called an Alford plea, where you say, well, I'm not saying that I'm guilty, but I acknowledge that the state has evidence against me, in effect. And it's essentially a way for a prosecutor to kind of save some face when they basically know that they have convicted an innocent person. And in a sense, it's our system's way of sort of splitting the baby in very similar, in my mind, to the not proven verdict that's available in Scotland and, as Heather points out, no other civilized country.
That's fascinating, though, because it sounds like that Alford plea is to protect the prosecution's box scores, whereas the Scotch verdict is a fascinating stopping short of making a decision. So our legal system might rush to a judgment that they then have to sort of back off of and fudge their way around, whereas the Scotch system, as it's presented in the novel, has an out to say, okay, well, we're not going to push it, we're not going to force it one way or the other. We're going to say we can't determine. And there's something, I can see all the ways that it's a problem, and I can see the way that it would taint Eustace's life forever, but it's also kind of charmingly human to say we just can't tell. Like, there is not a clear answer, and the book is pushing so hard against that, and yet so many different things come up. The fact that when Mrs. McCallan doesn't acknowledge Valeria at first, Valeria starts coming up with other ways to make that make sense. It's not that she disowns me as a potential daughter-in-law, it's that the name is Woodville is his name because she was married another. So there's so many different stories that we can tell that make things make sense, that to say we just don't know in a situation seems absolutely appropriate in a way.
I would say
I
this.
Want that verdict, but
so really quickly, I would say this. There are 2 points to make here. The first is that one thing that's somewhat different, a lot different about our system is jury trials are basically extinct on American soil. Nearly all criminal prosecutions today are resolved through guilty pleas. And so the role of judge, jury, and prosecutor is essentially merged in a modern American practice in the prosecutor. So when you see that baby splitting that a jury might do, in our system, it's prosecutors who are doing that kind of baby splitting at times, because they function as the jury and the prosecutor, because our system is essentially now just one of pleas, of plea bargaining. The second point I would make is that, going back to something that Sarah said earlier, really quickly, I'll say this. I think probably our system is better because it's understood that if you are acquitted by a jury, that doesn't necessarily mean that they thought you were innocent. What they're saying is that the case against you was not proven beyond a reasonable doubt. Mm. And so technically that leaves room for the possibility that the jury did think probably you were guilty, but not beyond a reasonable doubt. And in theory, and in sort of an ideal sense, if we've had the constitutionally prescribed public jury trial that you are entitled to here in America, in principle, the public has had an opportunity to see the case, like we saw, for example, the Rittenhouse case, Kyle Rittenhouse, or the killers of Ahmaud Arbery down in Georgia. And we can draw our own conclusions about what probably happened. And to me, perhaps that's our version of this not proven verdict. It's not formalized the way they do in Scotland, but it is left to the individual who's had an opportunity to see the case played out in public to draw their own conclusion about the moral status of an acquitted defendant.
And I think that's what Collins invites the reader to do throughout the whole course of the novel, right? As Valeria goes about her detection, and as we learn more and more of the details of the case, as all of the sort of scandalous and dark details of the daily lives of these people are sort of unfolded before us, we are invited to make exactly those kinds of moral judgments. Right. And we're given at the end, we know what happens at the end, right? Eustace's first wife was so depressed that she used the arsenic that she had planned to use to clear her complexion, instead to take her own life. And we're left with everyone deciding to just sort of hush that up, because that turns out to be a bigger scandal than to be accused of possibly having murdered your first wife. Though right. I always wonder whether Valeria has that like in her sock drawer somewhere, right? Or as Heather says, who she's writing to, right? And what's the occasion of this particular piece of writing? Well, we are about out of time, although I would love to talk to you guys about this novel for a lot longer. Thank you so much for when I called you and said, hey, do you want to read a big Victorian novel and talk to me about it for a while, for enthusiastically saying yes. And thanks for a great discussion today. It was a real delight to be with both of you.
Likewise. Thank you for the opportunity.
It's been a pleasure. And I want to give Valeria the last word. I refuse to submit to the Scotch verdict.